that is the kind of scenario that is real fat tail risk, black swanny, type risk stuff that, you almost don't want to think about, but you sort of have to think about a very extreme scenario like that.
How can businesses achieve energy independence in South Africa? This is a question that I posed to Piet le Roux and Russell Lamberti of the business advocacy group Sakeliga in a recent episode of my podcast, Solutions with David Ansara. What follows is a short extract from our longer conversation. If you would like to watch the full discussion with Piet and Russell, you can do so by clicking on the link in the description below. Enjoy. State failure does have a big impact on businesses. The operating environment is very challenging. And a modern economy requires consistent supply of energy, dispatchable energy. What has gone wrong with the energy framework in South Africa? What are the causes of load shedding? And how can businesses start to state-proof themselves and become energy independent?
That's probably a 3-hour podcast just by itself, but the essence of what's happened is that we've centralized the production and distribution of energy. That's been the case for many decades. For a while, that seemed to work to some degree. The problem with centralization is that you're always just one bad ideology, one bad policy, one mistake away from the whole thing kind of falling over. Amongst other things, but one of the important purposes of distributed or decentralized production in a market economy is that failure is inevitable. It's not that entrepreneurs are perfectly wonderful and never mess up. In fact, they probably make mistakes more than they succeed. And the only way that can be mediated into social progress and into a flourishing order is that those mistakes are decentralized. Those mistakes become much smaller and in sort of disparate parts of the system, so that when they happen, they don't collapse the whole thing.
Yeah, and failure is almost like a market signal.
Failure is a market signal, and failure is part of growth. We know that individually, right? In our personal lives, failure can lead to tremendous growth, and that's very much true for market economies. You need to see what doesn't work as much, in order to see what does work as well. So Eskom is this big centralized behemoth. And so that's precarious enough. Now, as we saw for decades, it can work to produce cheap energy, but it's now been beset by very bad policies of cadre deployment, policies of affirmative action, not a meritocracy, not allowing competition in energy, getting hugely bloated staff headcount, running up huge debts, getting bailed out by the state. So all these errors are starting to compound, and the real threat of this is that it's compounding into one gigantic mistake that is potentially fatal for the South African economy. Now, the idea of grid failure has been, touted and spoken about by experts. The grid failure potentially takes 3 weeks to a month to rectify, if at all, and even then, parts of the grid may never come back under that kind of scenario. That is the kind of scenario that is real fat tail risk, black swanny, type risk stuff that you almost don't want to think about, but you sort of have to think about a very extreme scenario like that. So what we say at Sakeliga is that risk, but not just that risk, everything in between here and that extreme risk, which is load shedding, which is losing energy for several hours in a day, becomes an intolerable risk and a threat to our vital interests, right? This is not a debate between whether the tax rate should be 25 or 26%, and we can have a polite political debate about that. This is kind of life and death. I mean, in certain instances where hospitals get cut off of energy and so on, it is literally life and death. And that's in the immediate term. And in the longer term, when you lose energy production, you regress, you de-develop. And when you de-develop, life expectancy goes down, mortality rates go up. It's a real crisis. So this is a business and community threat to the vital interests of all communities in South Africa. And so what we're saying is that that starts to become an intolerable risk and something where civil disobedience becomes wholly justified. You shouldn't have to make the moral case. It should be basically self-evident that to obey the state's rules on the energy monopoly is not necessarily the ethical position. The ethical position is to produce enough energy so that people can thrive and survive. And the real question becomes, how do you do that when the government is stopping you from doing it, when the government is reserving the right to disallow you from doing that, putting energy caps on. So it becomes a sort of politico-technical question rather than a moral question in my mind. It's unquestionably right to produce sufficient energy for a market that's desperate for it because it's such a critical part of life. So that's the kind of setup, I think, for where Sakeliga is heading in our thinking about this. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. There's some questions that remain unanswered as to how we achieve this. But I think the first step is to convince the public, and I think that's going to be a fairly easy job, is to convince the public that the right thing to do is to produce enough energy, because a lack of energy is just an unthinkable risk. And I think we must do that at local municipal government levels. We must also do that in the private sector at the corporate level. And this is also where we've got to overcome this very intense corporate compliance culture where they obey every single dictate of the state and actually say, well, who is sovereign over energy? Is the state really sovereign over whether I can produce energy and sell it to you, Dave and Ansara, for a price that you agree on? Is the state really sovereign over that? Is that what a free country means, that the government dictates that relationship? And so it's time to really change our thinking on that. And I think the time is right because we've seen just what a threat this is. And I think we're going to be able to convince people that this is at least the right direction to start moving in. And once you get a very big social movement in that direction, where you've got business, local governments, and the public on your side, then I think we're going to be able to make progress in producing energy, whether the law allows us to or not.
Recall that everybody in South Africa is supposed to pay e-tolls, but there was such a swell of opposition against that that it's simply not happening, and it's completely unrealistic to think that we will ever pay the kind of e-toll system that was intended 5 or 10 years ago. And I think in many instances, as the state retreats, as it fails, as it decreases in its ability to maintain the rules it sets, people will step into that vacuum. And it can either be anarchy or it can be ordered, an orderly introduction of alternative provision of the goods and services that the state fails. And exactly how that will take place is unclear. But I think that the future of energy production in South Africa is producers, whether for home use or for distribution and selling, step into the void left by the state and de facto provide energy in a decentralized way.
Providing a product.
Providing a product.
To consumers.
That's the future.
We've turned this into this political beast. It's just providing a product to consumers. It's called electricity. So we've got to, I think we can really shift the thinking on that. That's one of our goals.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one thing for, say, a professional services firm to put a solar panel on the roof or have an uninterrupted power supply, but an industrial economy requires scale. You can't run an aluminium smelter off of solar panels and windmills. So do you think that that's maybe the next challenge, is how to coordinate energy production and achieve that scale?
I don't think we need to coordinate too much, precisely because this can be provided in a decentralized way. Sakeliga, we shouldn't be in the business. We don't intend to be in the business of setting up power stations. But I know that some mines are doing very interesting things in this regard. But what we see our role as is creating the social momentum and the regulatory framework in which this can be done without undue risk of expropriation. And certainly as the state fails in its capacity to enforce its own arbitrary and harmful rules, that makes our job easier.
I think there's a meta-coordination role to be played, whether that's Sakeliga or us, plus other actors in society. yes, so it's not about building a power station, but that whole process requires some level of coordination in what, at least initially, will be a hostile regulatory and legal environment, and there's going to be real skill required to navigate that. And I think we will take on that role along with other social partners who can help us in that. But I think so Sakeliga sees itself at least contributing to the kind of meta coordination that's required, and it's at that level it is quite substantial.
Thanks for watching. I'm keen to hear from you. How do you think businesses can achieve energy independence from Eskom? Leave your thoughts down in the comments section below. Also, if you would like to watch the full discussion with Piet and Russell, you can do so by clicking here. And I'd also be grateful if you could subscribe to my other channel that's linked over here. My name is David Ansara. Until next time, take care.